Okay, welcome everyone. This is unfortunately our series on finding calm in the storm. The drive. Go for refuge. I'm back. Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened here. Somehow got kicked out of Zoom, but I'm back in Zoom now. Okay.
Short mandala offering was in Tibetan. Saji po ki ju
Amri Angejindu mekte uvari dokunam dachima choparsho idam guru ratna mandalakam niryatayami.
Refuge in bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go
For refuge until I am enlightened. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Sangye chodam
Soki Choknam La, Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuchi, Dagi Chunyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi, Drola Penchu Sangye Druparsho. Sangye Chodam Soki Choknam La, Jangchu Bardu Dagni Kyapsuchi, Dagi Chunyan Gi Pe Sonam Gi, Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Sho. So sorry, folks online, I forgot to reshare the screen after I came back in. So anyway, I think most of you know the prayers anyway, so hopefully not a big problem. All right, let's go ahead and do a short meditation before we begin tonight. It's always good to have a little bit of quiet time, focusing the mind, letting go of whatever distractions we might have from our day. And then we'll set our motivation together after this. So you can just spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath. And whatever technique you prefer, you can do that in silence and try to keep the awareness with the breath. When the mind wanders, just guide the mind back to the breath. Then again, I'll come in just a couple minutes to do a short reflection to set our motivation. So now let's set our motivation for this final class. And I want to do this by recalling some wonderful verses from Master Shantideva that we looked at towards the beginning of this course. And we have to constantly remind ourselves that the work that we're trying to do is not to make the outside world all wonderful and smooth, easy to get along with. Master Shantideva uses the example of desert. We have a perfect example. Lots of sharp objects, things that would pierce our flesh. We might have this view that it would be wonderful to just cover the entire desert with leather so it would be smooth to the touch. That way we could go anywhere we want because it's all covered in leather, all made very smooth. But that's not the work that we want to do. In the example, Master Shantideva says, we couldn't even find that much leather to kind of cover the earth. Instead, we should just cover our own feet, and then we can walk wherever we want and have our feet protected. That's what we're always trying to go back to in these teachings. Might be worthwhile at times to try to change things on the outside, but nonetheless, we're always going to run into prickly, sharp objects, people who annoy us, who irritate us. And it's important that we protect our own minds. So that can be our initial level of motivation to be here, to continue to explore how do we make sure that our own minds are at peace and patient in the midst of whatever it is that we experience on the outside. We can also do this work for others who are affected by the work we do on ourselves, initially by not harming those beings, by being kind and considerate to them, even in the face of their harm to us. But eventually we can help them at an even deeper level when we develop our minds to the state of Buddhahood, to that ideal state where we have removed all of our negative tendencies, not just our anger, annoyance, irritation, and so on, but all of the delusions down to the subtlest levels, and removed everything that obscures the mind. It will then allow us to have complete knowledge of their minds and how best to help them. And together with that, we develop all the amazing qualities that we will need to serve them. The deepest levels of kindness, compassion, love, patience, generosity, wisdom. So we set our sights on that greater goal that we can't achieve simply by our work tonight, but we're planting seeds. We're continuing to develop in the direction of Buddhahood, in the direction of this perfection of our being, where we will then be able to help others way beyond what we can do currently in our unenlightened state. So set that motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha, to be able to benefit all beings. And it's for this reason that we're gathered here tonight, to work on ourselves, to develop more patience in the face of our storms that we meet, to be able to find that calm, so we then can eventually benefit others to that degree, bringing them all to their full potential. You can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. Okay, so again, we've been working. Let me go ahead and put on the screen the outline of where we were in the course. We're getting towards the end of it. We have two topics to talk about in the sheets that you have. Again, all of these have been distributed through the weekly emails and what have you. So again, if anyone is needing any of these who's listening online, you can certainly contact through the email address that's at the website. And again, what we looked at last week was we started turning our minds towards other people. Because generally a lot of our minds of anger and frustration arise on the basis of other people doing things that are, against what we wish and against what we want. And again, I talked a little bit last week about how sometimes that does call for us to try to correct those things, because especially if they are harming other people, other beings, then it is good to be a voice to speak up for them. But nonetheless, in general, we can look at most of the times when we're being irritated by other people, we need to start seeing things from their point of view. And then the second thing, observing how we co-create situations, how situations are not arising to various factors, and often we are a factor in. I just wanted to introduce to you. I'm saying I'm off again because I can tell that I'm not there. I'm back. Okay. Whoa, all kinds of things happening. Let's see. Looks like Stella's there now. I'm gonna take this off of me on my screen. I can't have myself that big on my screen.
I had to make you co-host again.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so anyway, this whole idea, I won't read the passage again, but the whole idea of like we need to take into consideration the variety of factors that are out there. I want to show Galtung's triangle. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this, and you maybe not be able to see it so well on the TV here, but essentially what we have is these are factors that do influence people's behavior to some degree. They even influence our behavior to some degree. We have, of course, direct violence at the top of the triangle, right? Because that's what most of us think of when we think of violence. And of course, this course we're dealing with anger and how anger rises in us, and we might be involved in creating violence for others. But oftentimes it's other people directing violence at us. Direct violence is only a part of the picture, though. And obviously, all the things that are listed there, physical violence, sexual violence, verbal, digital, psychological, economic, all of this is what are supporting what's supporting that direct violence, though, are the two other legs of the triangle: cultural violence and structural violence. And these are not things that don't necessarily get a lot of attention, because this is like the water that we live in. This is the air that we breathe. This is the world that are involved in. Where there is cultural violence, which of course has to do with social norms, values, and beliefs, empirical and formal science, and so on, all these various things that inform our culture. When you go to different cultures, you often have different norms around what is seen as unsatisfactory or offensive or whatever. This is kind of what influences us in this country to some degree, is the American culture that we have been brought up in, most of us, and have become acclimated towards. And it does have elements of violence to it. It does have favoring of certain people over other people. And of course, we have a predominantly, white European culture that has formed in this country, and a country that was completely foreign to it when people from Europe arrived here. So essentially, that is one leg of the triangle. That is one thing supporting some of this. The other one is structural violence. And structural violence is kind of what we've done since we've been here, the ways that we have developed a society that also reinforces a lot of injustice. So we have repression and exploitation, social and ecological injustice, rich-poor gap, the gap between those at the high end of the scale versus those who are, barely surviving, and so on. All the things that are listed there, these are part of the structure that we have in our world. And why I'm just bringing this up is because oftentimes we don't think about this, and especially in the times that we're living in now. And next week's talk is going to be a talk, actually, Mary Jo attended it online last week at Tupten Oberling. I'm going to repeat that same talk, not verbatim, but give the same talk next Thursday night, where we kind of are dealing with the reality of how do we work with a society that has become so divisive, where there are so many gaps between people and trying to bridge those through whatever means that we can. Well, we kind of forget that all these factors of structural and cultural violence are playing a role in all of that too. And we just have to have that understanding. I'm finding that during these days, I'm giving people kind of a lot of space because I recognize that everyone's kind of in that simmering water that keeps getting hotter and hotter. And we're not realizing day by day how much hotter it's getting, but we're all in it. So I'm just, again, wanting you to be aware of that as well. And so when you're out in the grocery store or doing something and suddenly somebody gets very irritable and says something to you or does something, that you actually are able to see perhaps that there's other factors that are playing into that have nothing to do with you necessarily. Yeah, we can say we're part of the karmic connection that's happening there that's gone askew, but we can recognize many other things are playing into it these days. People are receiving a lot of energy from a lot of places. And so we have to kind of skirt our way through all of it and be mindful of it, and certainly not do things that trigger it for others as much as we can. Then take that responsibility of kind of being in the world. I just wanted to share that because I did have it in last week's slides, and I just didn't really get around to the slides last week so much. But I think it's an important thing to take into consideration. Normally, we think of causes and conditions as being, a number of factors that are mostly external. This is also external, but it's not so obvious, right? So tonight we are going on to, let me actually go back to our outline. We have the last two levels of practice. I don't know that I'll be able to do justice to everything in this. The fourth level of practice is where we'll start with looking at not just the other person, but trying to work with generating love and kindness towards others and compassion for others, because those are the ideal mindsets that we want to have in place of the mind of anger. It's one thing to not have anger arise, and that's a good start. Just stop it from arising through various things, thinking about its disadvantages, a lot of the things we've talked about. It's really ideal to supplant it with a mind that is its antithesis, is actually what we have in the wording of that song, with love, sweet compassion, because it's almost being erased from our culture to some degree. So this is what this next section is looking at, instead of
And
definitely, yeah, suddenly like, well, so let me try to see if, are you seeing what to do when Zoom has a mind of its own? Do you think it would help if I went all the way back out and to the website and tried going in again? stay or go away or what's going to happen. So please hang in there. I'll come back as soon as I can if it does boot me out again. But um, let me just stop the sharing. So, Ken, what we're going to do, we're going to work with these two ideas. Let me get out my notes just to make sure I'm covering all the points I want to. And then if you want to look up these things afterwards with the materials, and you can spend some time with them. But essentially what we're doing in terms of this section, and then we're going to go on to talk about emptiness at the latter part of it, is that we're trying to once more supplant these minds, this mind of anger with a mind that has some concern for the other person and a willingness to become more positive in our own state of mind in response to what's going on. Master Shantideva again uses this wonderful kind of inquiry, because the first part that we have to look at is it really the nature of sentient beings to be obnoxious, violent, intrusive, whatever, aggressive? And he says, okay, let's entertain each possibility. Okay, if it is the nature of sentient beings to do these sorts of things, and in some ways in Buddhism we talk about that, like you're under the control of your karma and delusions. Well, that's what most people are dealing with, right? Once you start learning Buddhist tools, then maybe you become less under the control of those things. But the karmic seeds that we planted do pretty much control what we are able to do in any particular moment. There's always the possibility of doing something different, but often it takes much more than, an impulse to do that. We have to actually have the tools and ability to do that. So essentially what we were talking about in the first possibility is that we're going to just use that as a premise. Yes, it's in the nature of sentient beings to harm each other, to be aggressive, to do all these sorts of things. Well, then Master Shantideva's response to that is, well, then why would you harm them? Because it's in their nature. That would be like getting upset at fire because it has the nature of being hot and burning, right? That is the nature of fire, right? Why would you get upset at fire if that's what it is? So if you go to that extreme and say it's in the nature of beings to be this way, which again is not the full Buddhist view, because as I said, we can say beings are under the control of their karma and delusions, but they really aren't completely, because we can change, absolutely. So then you go to the other possibility. Okay, that is not their nature. If that is the case, well then why would you get upset at them if that's not their nature? And he uses this example that is, well, I'm sure you've all heard it before, of essentially when you are getting hit by someone wielding a stick. So say, this isn't quite a stick, but it would probably put a little knot on your head if I hit you really hard with it, right? This little bell ringer. So if I'm hitting you over the head with this stick, why don't you get angry at the stick, Master Shantideva says? Anybody, why don't you get angry at the stick? The stick is what's actually hitting your noggin, right? We don't get angry at the stick because we say, oh, it's being wielded by the person, right? So you're going to get angry at the person because it's the person who's wielding the stick and bopping you in the head with it, right? Well, Master Shantideva says, well, then why are you angry at the person? Because the person is being wielded by their delusions. It's their anger, their jealousy, their pride, whatever it is that is causing them to do that harmful action towards you. They are being wielded in the same way. And now, again, in our culture, we don't have that tendency, right? We identify the person and their delusions to be one, right? That angry person, that irritable person, that jealous person, right? We make that kind of who they are. That's why I talked about earlier in this course how I like to not use that phrase angry person when we're talking about it, but rather a person with anger. It is a person who simply has the causes and conditions and the seeds of anger that have ripened into that coming into their mind. And again, when you remove those causes and conditions, an anger doesn't arise. And that's what we're trying to do here in this course for ourselves and hopefully for others over time. But the reality is that's the real enemy. That's the culprit. If we're going to get angry or upset at anything, if we're going to use that kind of language towards it, well, then we get upset at the delusions in the beings' minds, not at the beings themselves, because they're being wielded by these afflictions in the same way. So we got some space to look at them in a slightly different light, because we know what it's like when anger comes into our minds and suddenly it's taking charge and we're wanting to react in a very strong way to somebody who's doing something, so we can see the basic problem is that the problem isn't the beings themselves. As I mentioned, His Holiness the Dalai Lama often emphasizes this idea of kind of separating the person from their actions, and of course also then from their delusions. Now, again, some people may not have any interest in dealing with their delusions or making any corrective behavior and what have you. And some people may also hear about these teachings and go, well, that's a nice idea, but thank you very much. I'll keep my anger. I'm happy with my anger. Well, in a way, we can say the person becomes perhaps a little unreasonable there and looking at it that way, but that's still a delusion. I mean, it's still the mind of that being that is under the influence of various things that are flavoring it, that are causing that person to have that stubbornness or that, lack of desire to change their minds. So essentially, these mental states are the problem. What we need to see in terms of other beings is that they are under the control of these factors in the same way that we are. So again, this is something that our culture does very much, is identifying the person and their delusions as one. And we do this, and we kind of feel comfortable doing this with some figures, even in our current landscape, but certainly people of the past. People like Adolf Hitler, who many people, obviously, he caused so much suffering, pain, uh, just unbelievable suffering in this world, not just again, and through what happened in the aftermath of, with World War III and World War II, sorry, not three yet, not three yet, World War II and everything, that's happened in our world since then. But essentially, we have, this tendency of thinking like Adolf Hitler is pure evil. Well, he's not pure evil. He's a sentient being who has these delusions that rose to a level, and the karmic situation came there for him to be able to do a lot of damage through the force of those delusions. The delusions are still the problem. Adolf Hitler is not the problem. The sentient being suffering like all of us, right? So that's the important thing to kind of keep in mind when we're dealing with this first idea of kind of the nature of the other person. Is it the nature of the other person to do this harm, or are we really looking at the delusions as being the active factor involved in there? So the idea here is that we're not really getting at once more condoning or approving the actions that follow from that, certainly. And we certainly aren't condoning the delusions themselves. It's not something we want to keep around in our world. But we have to understand that sentient beings are kind of stuck in the middle here. They're delusions from the past that they've created all the seeds for, and the conditions ripen for them to come into their minds, and then they do all these horrible actions in our world. We can see that the beings themselves are still absolutely worthy objects of our kindness, our compassion, our love. So this is the idea behind this first one, is just do an investigation. Maybe I won't put it on the screen, but if we go to the practice 6, which you might have here in the Gompa, because we did have some copies of that, we see that there are 2 questions there. And they're basically what Master Shantideva was entertaining, right? Is it in the nature of this person to harm me and others? If so, is there any use in having anger towards them? Wouldn't that be like anger at fire for its nature of burning? And number 2, if it is not in the nature of this person to harm, why make yourself miserable getting angry at what is not really them? It's kind of, you're getting angry at them, but essentially you should be angry at the delusions. You should be angry at what is causing them to engage in this behavior. Since this behavior is extraneous to them, does it make sense to have anger towards the person? Right? To really recognize that we're all under the control of these factors to some degree, but that is not really our ultimate nature. We are not beings who are pure evil. And we use that in our culture a lot, right? Yeah. So again, this is one investigation that may help just to kind of loosen up this tendency we have to concretize that person as how we see them. And how even we talked about these factors that feed into anger and other delusions, how we even get kind of a force of upholding those same views through the people that we associate with, right? We go on Facebook and everyone mirrors back all the same views that we have about the people who are doing harm. And we hear in our discussions with other people who are like-minded, all that same mirroring back of that same attitude. We have to be aware of all of this and recognize that this is not a favorable mind to follow. The second thing is that, of course, we then want to be able to generate compassion towards others. As it says on your little sheet there, in the light of seeing this person as someone whose actions are motivated by their destructive emotions and disturbing attitudes, can you generate some compassion towards them, wishing them to be free from those mental states and from the suffering that they bring? Because that's really what we ideally would want. I mean, that's where I do hear some people sometimes say, well, oh, I can have compassion for people in general, but I can't have compassion for fill in the blank, whoever it is you think is like the despicable person on the planet or people on the planet, probably more than one of them. That is exactly the person you need to have compassion for. Because if there were enough people and enough of that force to be concerned about their minds and their well-being and the actions they're engaged in, then they would be free of all of that. I mean, not just by that alone, but hopefully over time they would see the light. They would be able to recognize their ability to change their minds. Every one of us has that potential. We talked about that previously, and I think we touched on it here, but also in many other courses, what we call Buddha nature. Buddha nature means that your mind is not cast in stone. Your mind is essentially clear and pure. And what pollutes it now is all the garbage that can be removed. And what is resonant with it are all the wonderful qualities that we're working on developing, like kindness, compassion, and so on. And we all have the seeds of those, as well as, of course, the seeds of all the affliction. So, what we're trying to do is help people through our own practice and then eventually being able to work on their minds to help them develop their minds to remove all those negative tendencies and see the true nature of their mind and develop everything that complements that to become the being that they really have. That's their birthright in a sense. Just by having a mind, they have Buddha nature. Every being has that potential. So that's the idea behind developing compassion for them. And as I said, they are the ones that need it the most. I think there's a little quote I had in my slides from can't remember if it was from Longfellow, but he says, be kind to those who are having a hard time. They need it the most. Be kind to those who are being really difficult. They need it the most. That's the essence of the quote. But we don't think that way often. We think like they deserve unkindness because they're the ones being unkind to others. They're the ones who need kindness the most, really. Number two on that little sheet, since you yourself have changed for the better over time, can you see the possibility that this person might also improve and cease their harmful actions? How does that make you feel about them? That's kind of what I've been talking about just now, right? That the fact that anybody who we encounter, that isn't who they are in an absolute way. They have that potential to change into this magnificent being, right? And wouldn't we be better to focus on that and trying to reinforce that than to do something to meet them at that same level of their afflictions, their delusions through the mind of anger that we're generating towards them? It makes much more sense to try to speak to that, to get through to that. So I'm going to read a little story that has to do with this idea of the next topic that we're moving into of responding to others with kindness. Venerable Thupten Chodron, she says in her passage on this, another way to deal with our anger at an enemy is to do the reverse of what we feel like doing. While our angry mind generally wants to retaliate by harming the other, changing our attitude and showing kindness is actually more beneficial for ourselves and for others. We can be kind without capitulating to others' unreasonable demands. So there's this wonderful story. Many of you have heard this story before. This is from a book by Lauren Ladner. He's actually in our organization in the Washington, D.C. area, works with our center, Guya Samaja Center there in Virginia. And he wrote this book on the lost art of compassion. And there's the wonderful story called The Gift of Golf Balls. Some of you have heard this before, but this story, he says, was told to me by George Farley, a fellow student of the renowned Buddhist master, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director. Some years ago, George was involved in planning and fundraising for a large event in Sydney, Australia. The Dalai Lama was to come and grant a Kalachakra initiation for the first time in the Southern Hemisphere. One of George's tasks was to raise awareness and funds by meeting with groups to explain the meaning of the upcoming ceremony. One such dinner was for roughly a dozen people at the home of Wendy and her husband Stuart. The guests were intelligent and the conversation flowed easily. People asked George many questions about Buddhism. Then over dessert, Stuart happened to tell a story that was clearly disturbing him. He had a very nice new BMW that he cherished. Some months earlier, he had been sitting quietly at home when he heard a crash in the street. Looking out the window, he saw that his much-loved sedan had just been rear-ended by his neighbor. He rushed downstairs and into the street in time to see his neighbor's car pulling up the street and disappearing into his garage. Well, there was a good deal of damage to the BMW. After taking a few deep breaths, Stuart went to the neighbor's house and rang the doorbell. There was no response. Repeated ringing and door thumping were met only by silence. When the neighbor continued avoiding Stuart, he submitted the bill to his insurance company. They eventually sued the neighbor with Stuart as a witness, and the neighbor had to pay about $5,000 for repairs to the BMW. A few weeks after the court case, Stuart found that the brand new paint job on his treasured car, which had been paid for by the settlement, had been gouged deeply. Someone had dragged a sharp metal object along the entire length of his car. Of course, Stuart suspected his neighbor. However, lacking proof and wishing to avoid further conflict, he had the car fixed, paying for it himself. A week after having the car fixed, he found yet another deep gouge running the length of his car. At this point, the vandalism was really beginning to get under Stuart's skin. He went to see his neighbor, who not only dismissively denied gouging his car, but also threatened to sue Stuart for harassment and slander for coming to his door with the issue. So again, this is at this point that he's having this meeting, whether this gathering at his house, and he's talking about this is where he's at. Stuart says, he felt trapped. Having gotten his car fixed for a third time, he was fearful and worried that it would get damaged again. So his car is now nice and new, but he's got a neighbor who potentially might, gouge it again. So unsure about how to handle this ongoing conflict, Stuart asked his dinner guests, what would you do? We love living here. We simply haven't the room to build a garage, so our cars have to be parked in the street. Frankly, it's driving me crazy. If I catch this bastard in the act, I won't be responsible for my actions. So this is where Stuart's at, right? He's pretty teed off. So Lauren says, from George's recollection of the party, says people suggested all sorts of options, from hidden cameras to extra sensitive car alarms. During the discussion about how to handle this conflict, George was quietly wondering what a Buddhist approach might be. He asked himself what his teacher, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, would do, and suddenly he knew. George said, Stuart, what you have to do is buy your neighbor an expensive gift, take it to him, apologize sincerely for all the trouble you have caused him, and ask for his forgiveness. Naturally, there were lots of strong reactions to this suggestion. The dinner party got very lively after that. Wendy, Stuart's wife, said, over my dead body, this guy's a lowlife, and we're going to make sure he gets what he deserves, right? Most of the present agreed, that George's suggestion was an unrealistic and overly altruistic approach. Okay. So again, they went on to talk about, the thought process that went through Stuart. And he said, Stuart remembered having heard that his neighbor was an enthusiastic golfer. So he decides he's going to try this. He went out and he, went over and he bought like half a dozen ridiculously expensive golf balls, the sort that are too expensive and indulgent for most people to buy for themselves. I don't golf, so I don't know what that is. I don't know that there's like hugely expensive golf balls, but I guess there are. He gift wrapped the golf balls carefully and beautifully. The gift, as well as the extent to which he transcended his own narcissism, were both extravagant. He went to his neighbor's house and he rang the bell. His neighbor was naturally wary and tense to find Stuart standing in his doorway, but Stuart smiled sincerely, and with an abundance of goodwill, he sincerely apologized for his past accusation, gave the neighbor his gift, and asked for his forgiveness. His neighbor just stood in the doorway, dumbstruck, holding the golf balls. At this point, regardless of his neighbor's response, Stuart already had transcended their previous conflict. In intentionally making himself vulnerable to his enemy, he had moved beyond his own vulnerability and fear. In embracing compassion, he had succeeded in joyfully losing an argument, just letting it go, not, why stay involved in it, entangled in it, right? Well, about an hour after receiving the gift, Stuart's neighbor showed up on his doorstep. It was clear he had been crying and was still choked up. He said that no one had ever shown him such kindness and that he was deeply sorry for all the problems that he'd caused. He made a commitment to being a good neighbor and, still on the verge of tears, offered to do anything he could to help Stuart in the future. From that point on, they became good, friendly neighbors. It should be a children's book, right? I always thought that when I read that, but what was interesting to me was that, okay, it's interesting enough that he chose that option and went with it, right? Was influenced enough by what George had to share at the party that he thought, well, why not? This is again, treating somebody with kindness when what you normally would do is everything you can to just have them get theirs, to, have that vengeance, whatever. So he was really doing that. That's remarkable. But what was really nice is that he felt complete after having done it, regardless of whether the neighbors showed up and apologized as well, right? That's kind of the icing on the cake. The cake itself was just engaging in that behavior, feeling much better about himself because he had actually extended kindness to somebody who had harmed him. This was modeled after that verse in the 8 verses of thought transformation by Geshe Langri Tongpa, where he says, um, uh, when others abuse me and abuse me, and harm me out of envy, I shall offer the victory to them and accept defeat upon myself. That's the essence of it. I'm not getting the words right tonight, but that's the whole idea. Like, can I offer the victory to someone else? Can I let them get the last word? Can I let them feel vindicated or whatever? We get into so many of these things where we just don't want to let go of that bone, right? We're just going to hold on to it and fight for it no matter what. And what's it like to let it go? Just to say, okay, doesn't matter. So I really like this idea of, this is one way that we can, again, all of these practices are something we can do on the cushion initially and kind of think about the people who are your next door neighbor type of person that has done things that maybe aren't at that extreme. Maybe they haven't caused you to get your car repaired 3 times, but they have done something that has been annoying or irritating for you. What's it like to sit down in meditation and think about how could I respond with kindness, of course, informed by what we talked about earlier, that this is another being like ourselves who under the control of their own crazy minds, doing things out of that isn't who they really are. And wouldn't it be much more beneficial to speak to that good nature inside there, that we know that that's in there, it's got to be in there. I even think that, again, with the most hardened cases, it's still there. We talked about Adolf Hitler earlier, Venerable Rabina, who most of you know, and she's coming to Santa Fe next month. So you get a chance to see her online or in person if you want to go down there. But she says even Adolf Hitler, loved his little doggy woggies, as she put it. He probably had German shepherds, but nonetheless, he loved his dogs, right? He cared for them. He, took care of them and loved them and fed them and cherished them as if they were his children, perhaps. I don't think he had children. Did Adolf Hitler? I don't think he had children. But anyway, there were people in Adolf Hitler's life who he really cherished and they really cherished him, right? They saw something in him that was different, perhaps, than what most of the world saw. Again, I'm not saying that should be the full label of who Adolf Hitler is either, but there's the potential for him to become something that is magnificent and beneficent. And, that's there at the same time that the potential to become something horrific and horrible is there. But Adolf himself, we can hold in the light of compassion, love. We can see him in that light because we know that that potential is there. So again, this is if we go to the little sheet on this, that's that section C, again, on page 17 or something like that, I think. No, not 78, page 8. I was thinking of the readings, page 8 of the practices. It says, responding to others with kindness. Is there the possibility of responding to this person with kindness? What does that look like in terms of what you would say or do differently? Now, that's an investigation once more we can do on the cushion. And then hopefully when we encounter that person again, and maybe they even start doing the behavior and whatever that we find offensive, how we might think about at that moment, really speaking to them, really, embracing them. One of the quotes that I wanted to share, everything's been going really well. Maybe I shouldn't try to share anything online. Oh, it's not turned on anyway. That's okay. I will share it here in the Gompa because I think I can share it here. There's this wonderful quote. This is from Marshall Rosenberg. Many of you have heard of Marshall Rosenberg. Whoops, it's not, why did it do that? Okay, let me go down to that quote again. I've encountered him more through the nonviolence work that I'm doing. He wrote the book Nonviolent Communication. It says, this is a wonderful quote from him. All criticism, attack, insults, and judgments vanish when we focus attention on hearing the feelings and needs behind a message. The more we practice in this way, the more we realize a simple truth. Behind all those messages we've allowed ourselves to be intimidated by are just individuals with unmet needs appealing to us to contribute to their well-being. It kind of changes again how we are viewing others. When people are, coming to us and wanting to, accost us with various things, often once more, it's a speaking to their own needs at the time that aren't being met. And that if we focus on that, remember I shared the example last week of the guy in the dog park who was like, when people would accost me and say, what do you need from me? Is there something I can do for you? I mean, it changes it because then it becomes really trying to help address what are the unmet needs and the unspoken needs that are going on there under the surface that are manifesting in somebody doing these behaviors, right? And if we are attentive to that and try to do what we can to, speak to them at that level, and even just to have empathy for them at that level, we might not be able to fix whatever is going on for them, but we can at least be with them and say, I'm so sorry that you're going through all of that, and da 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 da, whatever. So this is the point behind this. If we actually lower our own guard, don't have that mind, don't lead with your mind of anger, lead with your mind of kindness, seeing that person through that lens. Number two, is there something in your view of this person that is blocking them out of your heart at this time?
You can read it once.
Yeah, number two, the question is there something in your view of this person that is blocking them out of your heart at this time? In other words, are you too attached to your story about them or whatever your projection on the basis of what they are doing? Because we are really good at making up stories at everything happening around us. We do that all the time. And we don't, of course, question many of those stories. There's that wonderful bumper sticker, right? Don't believe everything you think, You can believe some things you think, but a lot of what we think is a lot of crazy nonsense, right? So we have to be able to kind of see what are the views that I'm having that are blocking me from really seeing them in the light of a suffering being, as somebody who I might need to, again, approach with kindness rather than, all armed, ready to defend myself. Does recalling that this person want to be happy and doesn't want to suffer help you to feel a common bond with them and thus respond with kindness? Sometimes that's also enough just to recognize that there's no difference between myself and any other being I meet, even any animal, any other, we have the encounter with beings from other realms even, but they're all the same in that fundamental need, just beings that are simply looking for some measure of happiness, trying to avoid what causes pain or suffering. If I see them through that lens, that of course is the lens of compassion and loving kindness that sees they are driven in that way and they are entitled really to have freedom from suffering and to have the happiness that they seek. Then question 4, by seeing that your own well-being depends on the kindness of others, such as this person, does it help you to feel more affection and gratitude towards them? This is something that's brought out a little bit in the readings, but essentially, this is another way for us to kind of lead with kindness is when we appreciate the kindness that others have shown us. I talk about this frequently whenever I teach on equanimity, and I'm going to go into equanimity as the first of the 4 immeasurables. Next week, again, we're doing the class on this bridging our differences. But then I'm going to go through the 4 immeasurables the rest of the Thursdays in May. And the very first one is equanimity. Equanimity means that we have to be able to see that every being is kind of connected to us. I also bring this up in immeasurable love. I'm sorry, I bring it up maybe even more there. It's part of the process of equanimity. But in terms of immeasurable love or kindness, if we see that other beings have been kind to us, then we have a natural response of wanting to reciprocate with kindness. Let's look at the 3 groups really briefly. If we talk about the friends, the people who we are quite close to already and we have some positive regard towards, it's easy to see their kindness, right? Because they're very much involved in our lives. They do things for us. They bring us little gifts on our birthday or, treat us to lunch here and there or whatever. How wonderful that we have those beings showing us that kind of direct and intentional kindness. But we also have a lot of strangers in this world that are behind the scenes and involved in our welfare. I mean, I always point this out that during the pandemic, if this didn't become evident to us, I don't know what would do it. Many of us, some people were on the front lines and doing things that needed to be done, but a lot of people had to withdraw, quarantine, be in their own home so that they weren't spreading this thing like crazy, right? And they were benefited by all the work that everyone else was continuing to do. Sure, we ran out of toilet paper every now and then or something, but essentially most of our needs were met by people continuing to do that wonderful work that they do to grow the food and harvest the food and package the food, ship the food, sell the food, sometimes prepare the food. I mean, you had so many people that are involved in not just people, a lot of things are produced through the kindness of insects and animals and what have you. So, you have we were on the receiving end of so much indirect kindness that we can be grateful for. Because if those beings hadn't continued doing that during the pandemic, we would have starved. It would have been like, oh, I got to start growing some vegetables or something. I'm not going to have anything to eat next week. Well, good luck, right? So the idea is that we see those doing something that we call indirect kindness, and it's not even that intentional either, right? They might be getting paid to do all this work. They're not doing it with any intention of, oh, I can't wait till Dawn eats these veggies that I'm growing, right? That's not the case. But it's a kindness. Kind of redefine what we mean by being on the receiving end of kindness. In terms of what we want to give, we want to be sure to give more overt kindness, the kindness that is really on the spot, concern for the other person. But let's talk about the third category, because these are the tough ones. This is what we're dealing with mainly in this course, right? How are those people, the enemies, the difficult people, how are they kind to us? Well, some of them are in those kinds of jobs, right? They are doing the things that we need to have going on that we depend upon for the power that goes through our, electric lines and, the computers that we buy and all the various things, that are involved in our welfare. But they are also giving us an incredible gift. The difficult people in your life give you the opportunity to deepen your patience and your loving kindness and compassion in ways that the other two groups don't give you an opportunity to do. How wonderful. I mean, it's not, again, this is a tricky one. To see it as kindness does take some thinking, right? Because we are labeling it in our culture as being unkind, because they are being directly unkind to me and those that I love. And therefore, I have in my mind every right to be unkind to them. But can I see them being unkind to me in that way as actually a kindness? We need those people to deepen our patience. And remember, patience is one of the six perfections of a bodhisattva, the paramitas. If you don't deepen your patience, you cannot get to enlightenment. And because you are having these blocks, as we were just talking about, to those beings being in your heart, you're never going to get to enlightenment as well. So you need to deepen your patience for people, which requires that they piss you off sometimes, that they do things that are not so good, right? Because that's how you develop the patience muscle. You don't develop it with all the friends and people who are sweet and kind to you. Now, again, some of them also piss you off too. Don't get me wrong. I often refer back to a course I did on conscious relationships where I talked about having equanimity to the same person at three different times, right? Sometimes they do seem like a friend and they're really sweet. Sometimes they're like a stranger, like, who the hell am I in relationship with here? And other times they manifest as an enemy, right? They do things or say things because they know you really well. They can get your goat really easily, right? Yeah. I said push your buttons, right? So the idea here is that we need those people doing offensive things to us. And we've created the karma for it too. Admittedly, we talked about that previously. That is our difficult person manifesting. But let's take advantage of that. Let's actually deepen our patience, deepen our kindness, our love, our compassion for beings when they're in our lives in that way.
Thank you, that's very important.
Yeah. I mean, I was struck really when Lama Zopa Rinpoche, the last chance I had to do retreat with him, actually to see him, was in 2017 in North Carolina, where we would do the 2 week, it was 4 weeks one year, but it was generally a 2 week retreat with him. And just amazing experience. And at the end, this was the first year, of course, that we did retreat where we had a President Trump. Yeah. Anyway, I won't tell you about what happened in 2016 when he was asked for his thoughts about that. But anyway, that was before the election. So after the election, when he would do the dedication prayers at the end of the day, he would do the same one that we do in essence around bodhicitta. May the precious bodhicitta mind, ripen in the minds of all sentient beings, and especially in all Americans, and especially in Donald Trump, he would say. This is kind of what he wants for these beings who are difficult, who are challenging in our world, is for them to become the most compassionate, kind, loving being that they have the ability to. They've got the seeds of that, and we want that to happen to them. that's seeing them again through a totally different lens. And it really struck me that Rinpoche would single out President Trump. I mean, how often do any of us in the room, do that with our own dedications? How often do we think, oh, I want to wish well for Donald Trump in terms of his heart, his mind changing in a more positive direction? It's a very powerful thought. Maybe we need that. Like instead of a protest day, we all do this like around the world. We all generate thoughts of loving kindness and compassion to Donald Trump that he may change his mind and become a more, you know, loving, kind person himself. So again, we need those people in our lives to deepen those kinds of skills and abilities. And of course, we have to, work with them as best as we can. Maybe we can't change everybody in this life. That's probably a given that we're not going to change people, that easily. But nonetheless, we can still work on changing our own minds in response to them. And so we're not so bent out of shape whenever we hear that person's name or what have you. So that's that question 4, kind of seeing that we are connected through this interdependence that we have with all beings. What was that phrase of 6 degrees of separation or something, like you are no more than 6 degrees of separation from anyone on this planet, right? That's the human beings. But of course, we are interconnected with everyone. There's this concept of Indra's net in the Vedic traditions, right? Of us all being kind of jewels in this net that is all connected. And we can't see ourselves from that isolated point of view, which is what the mind of anger does. Let me go on to the final question on this, and then we're going to get on to emptiness and talk about how we apply the wisdom teachings. But essentially, it says here, number 5, is it possible at this time to see that you need this difficult person to cultivate true love and compassion for all beings? Since in this way they are giving you a kindness, why would you not want to respond with kindness towards them? And if we really frame it in that way, if I really look at it and say, this being in front of me by pushing my buttons is giving me an incredible opportunity to practice patience, loving kindness, compassion. I know it's challenging, Anne-Marie, right? Because that's not again, and our culture doesn't support it. I mean, I know that this is once more going against the grain of everything happening around us, right? Everyone wanting to, rise up against all of this and everything. And again, don't misunderstand me. The actions that beings are engaged in need to be condemned and to be addressed in as peaceful a way as we possibly can. But the person, we have to have kindness, compassion towards the person. Anyway, maybe preaching to the choir. I want to show just a couple more quotes because there was this wonderful quote that, let me scroll down here. This is from Father Thomas Keating. I like this quote. If one completes the journey to one's own heart, one will find oneself in the heart of everyone else. Kind of like that, And then this is the one from Albert Einstein, but I think I want to talk a little bit. Maybe that one's okay. I've kind of covered that. I'm sorry. This is the one that I think is really precious from Khalil Gibran. I have learned silence from the talkative, tolerance from the intolerant, and kindness from the unkind. Yet strange, I am ungrateful to these teachers. So again, I think that's the point of it, is like, can we learn to be grateful for the beings in our lives who maybe they point out to us our own faults even. Sometimes when we see that, well, I think this is true with everything. If we see something in somebody else, chances are we've already got that within ourselves, or we wouldn't recognize it, right? So when we see people being intolerant, being unkind, well, let that be a reminder that we have the seeds of those too. And we need to learn kindness from those who are unkind, patience and tolerance from those who are intolerant. Anyway, I think that's probably enough on that whole thing, but this really is the more traditional antidote to anger. When it's taught in the Lamrim, the stages of the path, they often say, anger or hatred towards another being, the antidote is loving kindness and compassion. Hard to generate, but nonetheless, we've got to work up there. That's why this is later in this practice thing. Start off with the practices that we can maybe get our head around a little more, start to whittle away at our anger a bit, and then work up to what's it like to actually generate these thoughts of loving kindness and compassion when we're being accosted by somebody. There was a story, and I should have shared that story here, but I found it on somebody posted it on Facebook. But there was this gentleman, and I think it was in Massachusetts, in Boston area or something, where somebody did accost him on the street and asked for his wallet and everything, and it was at knife point or gun point or something like that. And he was like, giving it, and then he took concern for this. He said, "Do you need something more than this? Because I would like to offer that to you because you must be this. If you're doing these sorts of things, you must be really desperate. You must be in really bad shape." He says, "I was on my way to go have dinner at this restaurant, and I'd love to treat you to dinner. You won't need my wallet back to do that, but I would love to sit down with you and hear what is all going on for you." And it like totally changed the dynamic of the situation. I was just really touched when I read this story. I'll have to find it and share it with all of you. But you know, that's not how we, again, normally when somebody's doing something that's that invasive and we feel so threatened and fearful and whatever, our more instinctual thing is to fight back and to be defensive. But what is it like to actually see that as a suffering being? To say, what do you really need? You must be in great need for you to be out on the streets at this hour, in the dark with, wearing dark clothes and wielding a knife at people. I mean, seriously, that's how we should be seeing it, that this poor being is going through such a tough time that they have to do this. I don't know. So now we are moving on to the more advanced, the most advanced teaching, perhaps, which is how do we see the nature of reality at the more ultimate level? A lot of what we talked about throughout the course was like, how do we at least understand what's going on and what makes more sense if we really open our eyes? And that's more at a conventional level. Now we're looking at the ultimate level. How do things actually exist? And of course, the main point here, although we're going to apply this wisdom to everything involved in this scenario, you can do that. The main thing is to apply that wisdom in regard to the I. This I that is just at the centerpiece of this whole craziness that we are trying to defend and protect and get what it needs. And this I that is pure fiction. In the Buddhist teachings, I'm going to approach it from the point of view of going into dependent arising, because I think it's really important to kind of have that as the foundation of an understanding of how the I does exist. The Buddha never said that you don't exist at all or that anything doesn't exist at all. Things that exist conventionally do exist conventionally, but how do they exist conventionally? So if we take the I, and we'll just work with that tonight, we won't work with other phenomena. If we take the I, we see that essentially there is this basis of this body and mind, and then a sense of I that we have in relation to this. Well, at the deepest level of dependent arising, because I don't want to go through all of it, many of you have heard these teachings before, but at the deepest level, all that is here is a thought of I, a designation of I, an imputation of I. We have a thought of I in relation to this continuum of stuff that is essentially a body and a mind. And of course, there are many parts to our bodies and our minds. But essentially, you have those two main components that are the basis for a person. And person, or I, is simply a label, a designation that we give to this collection of stuff. It's nothing more than that. The Buddhist teachings on emptiness, what he's saying essentially is that the person, and all phenomena for that matter, but let's talk about the person is empty of existing on its own, setting itself up, being self-established, existing independently. Instead, the person exists in this very, very subtle way. Just a thought of I. That's all that there is. There's nothing more than the thought of I. Of course, every time the mind of anger arises, every time any of the other delusions arise, it believes in so much more than that. It thinks that there's this real I here that I need to defend. And I need to make sure that this I is taken care of. Well, that I doesn't exist at all. The I does exist, but again, in this very, very subtle way. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would often use this phrase that really, struck home for me. It's almost as if the I doesn't exist. You have to go really, really thin, like this. It's almost as if the I doesn't exist. Because the way the I exists is so slight, so subtle. What they call it nominal existence. Nominal existence means it's only through the force of being named. There's nothing objectively there. This is a thought of I that we all have, again, quite instinctively. It's not something that, again, it comes from nowhere. We all think of this as me, this collection of stuff.
And we, of course, don't think that strongly in a deeper way that I'm my body or I'm my mind, but we have this sense that there's an I here. And once more, we go about our lives being even kind of reinforced through all of our upbringing, whatever, to protect this I, to defend this I, to put this I up on a pedestal and make sure that all of its needs are met. And of course, it doesn't exist at all. Now, again, the reasoning of dependent arising, where we can see actually there are three levels. This is the third level, the subtlest level. I'm just going to touch very briefly on the other two. The I also exists in dependence upon causes and conditions, right? There's all kinds of causes and conditions that cause the being known as Don to be in this world. There was the karma that informed this life from a prior life, the continuity of awareness that came in to the fertilized egg in my mother's womb, and the growth of that through all of the various things that allowed my body to continue to grow, and then eventually me pop out of the womb with my mind more active than it was in the womb, and I'm like looking around and forming my ideas of things and all that. All of these kinds of causes and conditions that have influenced me to be who I am now. And we are all a product of our causes and conditions. There is no Don, no person, no I without the causes and conditions. Depends upon them. The second one is the parts. And the parts, as I said, for a person are essentially the main two. What is physical, form, body. What is non-physical, non-material, which is mind. Those are the two parts. And of course, we depend upon those parts. You can't have a person without both of those parts, right? Well, we do have some beings in the formless realm that don't really have a concrete body per se, but nonetheless, you have to have a basis for a person. You have to have those parts there, or you can't have the person. The third level is what I just mentioned, that in the end, it's dependent upon imputation, dependent upon me thinking of this as I. That's why also Master Shantideva says we can enlarge our sense of I to no longer be limited to this, this experience of this body and mind. We should have concern for the suffering of beings because they're suffering and not think that, oh, it's their suffering and not my suffering. It's enough that it's suffering, and I should be able to get out of that trap of thinking I'm some isolated, separate self and be concerned for the world at large on the basis of a bigger view of who I am or what exists. So there's a conventional aspect to this as well, but the deeper truth is that there is no real I, that I've been working all my life and countless lifetimes prior to this to defend and to take care of and to protect and make sure it gets what it wants. It's an illusion. It appears to be so real, but it doesn't exist that way at all. So that's the deeper truth that we need to be kind of working with eventually in regard to undermining our anger, is see that the main object of this anger, that I, that is upset and having all these distorted views and what have you, mistaken, what was the word that was used, the inappropriate attention. We talked about that earlier, like I think about things in a false way. Well, the deepest error that I'm making is that I think that there's a real me, and of course I think there's a real person who's harming me. There's a real harm of that. All of these things are merely labeled, merely designated. There's no real me. There's no real anything. Lama Zopa would use that word real. He doesn't mean that there's no reality at all, again, because even he said it's almost as if the I doesn't exist or that things don't exist, but they still exist. But once more, they exist just very minimally, just through naming, just through designating. So obviously this requires a bit more investigation and analysis before we can bring that awareness into our everyday life, but it can be done. Besides dependent arising and seeing that in the end the I exists in this extremely subtle way, you can do this 4-point analysis, which I'm just going to go through really briefly. Again, it's in all the Lamrim texts because it's really one of the main analyses to get us to that feeling of emptiness, that there is no real I here. The first step is bring to mind what that real I feels like. Well, these instances that we've been talking about in this course where the I feels somewhat threatened, where it's not getting what it wants, are the perfect opportunity to see how it appears. It appears to be so real and solid there. I mean, I often feel like there's something kind of right here in the center of my chest. It's like, that I that I'm defending, right? That needs to kind of put other people in their place or what have you. Well, that's the first step. get a clear view of how that I appears at that time. It appears to be extremely real. Then you go through the possibilities of where it would exist if it actually did exist. Because the fact that it appears so real and concrete means that it must be findable. You must be able to find the I here somewhere, right? That real I has to have something that's kind of, we use the phrase, the true referent of it, something that that I is referring to that is that real thing, that real I that we are defending. So you look at the possibilities in this second step. Well, the possibilities are essentially it's going to be somewhere on this collection of stuff. That's the more likely option, right? But you also have to include the possibility that it's something that is not on this cushion, that it's apart from the body and mind. And that's just because you want to have a good, kind of full investigation to make sure that you haven't, left any possibilities for that real I to exist. But the more likely one is what we do in the third step. We go, okay, let's look and see, is there a real I here together with equivalent to the body, mind, some part of the body or the mind? And you just start looking. I mean, you can also look at the consequences if it were to be any of these things. That's another approach. But it's also really helpful just to go looking, like you would look for keys in a drawer that you normally throw your keys in. You just go, oh, are they in there? Well, where is that real I? Is that I in this body somewhere? I talked about feeling a sense of I right here. Well, does that mean you don't have to do this? But if you were to open this up, is there some little I in there going, hi, you found me, I'm here, no, there's no, there's just bones and arteries and veins and all kinds of muscle and tissue and whatever. I mean, you're not going to find any I. We've seen it on TV enough, perhaps, to not have to investigate ourselves by opening ourselves up. But the idea is that you can go looking through all of the body. Is the I in the head? Is it in the brain? Is the I in the heart? Is the I in my legs? Is my I in my nose? I mean, is my I in my eyes? You can exhaust yourself going through all the various parts of the body and you never find anything that's the real I. Because if you find something that's a real I, then you found it. You found the real thing that is that full sense of I. And it would mean that it's a unitary phenomenon because it feels unitary, right? I don't feel like there's two eyes here, not those two eyes, two eyes, right? I don't feel like there's two eyes here. So I'm looking for something unitary and something that withstands analysis, that when I find it, I go, ah, there you are, you're the real I. It doesn't happen with the body. Well, let's talk about the mind. Well, we have to pick apart our minds. We'd like to think of mind as being somewhat singular, and there is a kind of a continuity of awareness that is ours in a sense. It's kind of going through all of our lifetimes, but it has many facets to it. We have the five sense consciousnesses. We have the mental consciousness. Is one of those the real I? Well, if you say it's the mental consciousness, because that's the more likely one rather than our eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, well, then that has to be the real I in all ways. Does that mean that you are equivalent to your mental consciousness? That means you are your thoughts, because all your thoughts are in your mental consciousness. They aren't with your sense consciousnesses. You are your anger. Well, you get it with like a lot of things inside this. Well, which one of those are you? Are you your wisdom? Are you your compassion? Are you all of these things? Again, this is one of the kind of what speaks to the fact that things, once more, cannot be some unitary phenomenon, is that they all have parts. As I said, that's that second level of dependent arising, and everything depends upon its parts. Even something we think of as unitary, like mental consciousness, has many different parts to it. Everything has parts. So you go down to the next part, it has parts. Go down to the next part, it has parts. You just keep investigating and you never find something that's kind of partless at the bottom of the well, right? It just doesn't happen. I know scientists are doing this. They're doing all that kind of investigation into quarks and subquarks and trying to find, they use this phrase, the God particle or something that they can rely upon as like this quintessential unitary building block that they can identify, and that we're going to put all our money on that now. But even a small particle is going to still have parts, right? It's got to have directional parts to it, top, bottom, left, right, whatever, if they're going down to that level and investigating things at that level. So we don't find physically or mentally anything that is equivalent to this real I. So that's in essence what goes on. Again, I'm not going to go into the detailed explanation of this because Many of you have heard it before, and as I said, all the Lamrim texts, they all have that full investigation. The third step is where you might spend most of the time. Of course, the first step is crucial. You have to really know what you're looking for. You determine it's either going to be in the collection of stuff here on the cushion or on the chair, or it's going to be apart from that. Well, here, is it equivalent to anything on the cushion? Is it equivalent to the body or the mind or any part of the body or the mind? The fourth one is you're going to do this real basic investigation. Can there be an I that is not together with this body and mind, independent of this body and mind? Well, imagine in your own mind right now, you can think about, I'm going to take my body and mind and I'm going to put them over to my left or right or wherever you want to put them. Is there an I remaining on the cushion? It's a simple investigation, right? All you got to do is remove body and mind and see if there's something else that is the I that is not the body and the mind. Remove them. Is there an I remaining on the cushion? If I were to move my body and mind over there, is there a little I sitting on the cushion going, you found me, here I am. I was here all along. Now, again, the Buddha's initial reasoning around, negating this I came out of the Vedic traditions where they hold to what's called Atman. I don't know, I'm not well versed enough in the Hindu, traditions to know every aspect of it, but it had that feature of being something independent of the body and mind. That was what reincarnates in, the Vedic traditions, is this Atman. It's equivalent to a soul, essentially. I was taught about a soul in my Roman Catholic upbringing. I never was really clear about what it was referring to. It was just this immortal piece of something, a piece of God or something that, I could rely upon as being an aspect of me going on to my next life or, in heaven or whatever. The Buddha didn't adhere to that. He held a philosophy of anatman. There is no atman. That's really that fourth step where you kind of look and go, is there something else here that is not the body and mind, that is the real I? And the Buddha said, well, then show it to me. He wasn't being kind of cruel or, unkind to the people of the Vedic traditions. He's just saying, I don't see the basis for this. Essentially, we boil down to those two main components in terms of the basis for a person, a body and a mind. And if neither of those is the person, and you can't have a person apart from the body and the mind, well, then essentially, this real person doesn't exist. That's the conclusion you come to after having gone through this analysis. So once more, you have to familiarize yourself with these analyses in order to be able to bring that awareness into play. So that when you're sitting there and somebody's yelling, this close to your face, all red-faced at you, you're able to see, oh, there's my I, that strong I arising that wants to defend myself in the face of this. And I know that doesn't exist. So you've kind of pulled the rug out from underneath your anger because your anger cannot stand on the absence of that. Emptiness is what removes the stuff from which anger is built, the stuff from which jealousy is built, and greed is built. All the delusions are built on this. So again, I can't do justice to this topic with just the time that I have, but at least I've touched on it a bit. We've got about 5 minutes left tonight. I do want to open it up if there are comments or questions. And then maybe I'll share this wonderful little poem called The Empty Boat by Chuang-Tzu. I don't know if you ever heard the poem on the empty boat. Yes, please, Jeannie.
So how do we reconcile in our minds the fact that, like in the case of the Dalai Lama or other great lamas, when they go on a search for that individual, that it is the reincarnation of what?
Yeah. Well, there still is a conventional process going on in the midst of emptiness. I mean, emptiness doesn't negate that things function, essentially. So you do have a continuity of awareness that comes from the prior life that is then being identified as being connected to a new body in this life. So you can still say, now hopefully we're not reifying it, and certainly when they say it, they're not reifying it, thinking there's some real person there, but they are saying nonetheless, a person still appears. A person will be the product of all the various causes and conditions, the parts that come together of the body and mind assembling in the womb, and then the mere designation of this is, Lama Zopa Rinpoche's tulku. It's, or whatever the case might be. So that's the tricky thing is, we don't really ever negate the conventional stuff that's going on. We just say, it doesn't exist in the way that we think it does.
Right.
It isn't real in the way that we think it is. It's just the play of emptiness they often talk about.
So it frees it from the possibility of it becoming egoistic.
Absolutely.
So that would be that it goes through, but
Yes.
without that.
Yes, frees it from being egoistic entirely, because
Yeah.
the egoistic kind of tendency is the main driving force of all of this,
Okay,
you know.
that's good.
So yeah, everything still unravels within samsara in its own way, based on all the causes and conditions that feed into it. But none of those things exist in like a concrete way. It's more like once more a play of factors within emptiness.
And
Yeah.
subtleties.
Yeah. So this is where these two, dependent arising, which speaks to how things arise in dependence upon all these factors. Reincarnations arise, ordinary beings arise, chairs arise, tables arise, computers arise, all these various factors arise. That's the conventional side of it, and that is totally complementary to emptiness, that they don't exist independently, that they don't exist on their own. Instead, everything is arising in this net, this web of interconnectivity, interdependence. So they still can be isolated by conventional minds like ours as, oh, this is a chair and this is a computer and this is a table, but they have no chairness, computerness, tableness from their own side. That's not how they exist. They exist merely through these ways that we have dependent arising, through causes and conditions, the parts that are assembled, and then eventually that designation. This is a chair, this is a computer, this is a table. There's nothing from the side of any of those bases that make them those. That's purely our designation. It's tricky stuff. It's really tricky stuff. Any other comments or questions? I really want to share this one little poem with you because I think it's really quite wonderful. Let me do that. And then certainly there'll be opportunities to ask questions about all this stuff at another time too. So we don't absolutely have to answer all questions now.
I'd like to share a little quote that I heard somewhere
Oops.
that I liked.
Oops, not there. Yes, please. Go ahead, Mary Jo, because I'm going to have to pull up another document.
Listening with the ear of your heart.
Hmm.
And I kind of like that.
Listening with the ear of your heart. Yeah, yeah.
That's,
It's a nice phrase. I like that too.
I don't know who said it.
I'm really bad about those things. Venerable Rabina often calls me on it. She goes like, "Where did you hear that? Who are you quoting?" Doesn't like me to quote things without knowing the source. So I think it's on the next page, last page here. Okay, this is the poem, more or less poem, called The Empty Boat from the Way of Chuang-Tzu. I'm going to use person. This is always these old things are translated as man, but we mean person. If a person is crossing a river and an empty boat collides with their own skiff, even though they be a bad-tempered person, they will not become angry. But if they see another person in the boat, they will shout at that person to steer clear. If the shout is not heard, they will shout again and yet again and begin cursing, and all because there is somebody in the boat. Yet, if the boat were empty, they would not be shouting and not be angry. If you can empty your own boat, crossing the river of the world, no one will oppose you. No one will seek to harm you. This is this idea, I think we've heard of the story before of like, somebody, it's like a foggy day or something, and somebody's in the boat and they see a boat coming at them and they just are yelling like, "Stop, you're going to run into me, you're going to run into me." And of course the boat comes and there's nobody in the boat. So, everything becomes disarmed when there's nobody in the boat. We got to empty our own boats and recognize that every boat we encounter is also an empty boat. Because that's the whole thing too, is it's not just me that's empty of inherent existence, it's everything. Every other person is also in the same status. But of course, all of us and almost the entire world suffering from that delusion. This is what that quote I was going to share of Albert Einstein's, that way that he called it an optical delusion, that we are kind of separate and independent from everything else, right? We are all connected. That's the interdependence. And therefore we don't stand alone, self-sufficient, self-established. We're all just a bunch of empty boats.
so why are we individualized?
That's the root ignorance that's really involved in all this, since beginningless time. And of course, the Buddha, when he was asked these questions, well, where did that come from? Like, what is the source of that, that optical delusion and our, mental delusion that occurs on the basis of that? He says, well, just refuse to answer, because his point is not where did it come from? His point is get rid of it. Because if we get rid of it, then it stops all of the nonsense for ourselves and begins the process of our ability to help others to get rid of it. Once we get rid of that me and you, self and other, all of that kind of duality, again, that is purely a construct. It's not real in the way that we think it is. Then we begin to live more wholeheartedly and engaged with others. And then, everything is possible from there. Whereas nothing is possible when we continue to keep bumping up against each other from this individualistic, self-reifying kind of mind. It's interesting stuff. I mean, when I first heard teachings on emptiness, it wasn't when I first started not going to Buddhist teachings, because it was interesting. The first group that I got involved with, they didn't talk about emptiness hardly at all. I mean, I never really even heard the word till I came to the Gelugpa Center, and Venerable Rabina, bless her, she was the one who kind of zapped me with it. And I was like, wow, that's what it's all about. And that's what it's all about. Anyway. Okay. Maybe, yeah, this is good enough to end on. I do want to share a little bit of advice from Lama Zopa Rinpoche on working with all of this around anger. I pulled up the wrong one. How did that happen? I clicked on that, I thought. There we go. I think it'll come up right now. Nope, it's still doing the same thing here. It's coming up on the other screen online. You're getting it, John?
Yes.
Yeah, the green. I don't know why that isn't here on the screen here. Let me pull it up here if I can.
There's something green on this one here.
Are you getting it? Maybe it was just me from Lama Zopa. Okay.
You must
Well,
know
let me.
the date.
Okay, so I might not have it quite on the right screen. Yeah, there's one screen before it where it says every morning when you generate bodhicitta, your motivation of becoming a Buddha, thinking, may my life become Dharma and may everything I do become a cause of enlightenment. At the same time, you must make sure to also think, in this life and especially today, I'm going to practice patience. Then continuing with the screen there, you must motivate like this in the morning as otherwise, because your mind is so powerfully habituated to anger, you will miss this precious opportunity to practice patience. Therefore, in the morning, you have to make a plan, a strong decision, thinking, I'm going to practice patience. See if I can somehow, I can't get it up to be able to go to the next screen in yours. There's one more bit of the quote. You have to prepare yourself, just like soldiers in an army preparing themselves before fighting, because the important thing for them is to shoot their enemy. Like that, you have to be ready. You have to plan everything well beforehand. And that's it. Anyway, the idea here is that, I've introduced you to a lot of stuff over these 4 Thursdays, right? A lot of different techniques. You've got the little practice sheets. Don't think that just a cursory examination of these topics is enough. You have to make the dedication at the beginning of every day that I'm going to practice patience when I encounter these difficult situations, and do the meditations that kind of support you at the level that you're at. I divided them into different levels based on things that are a little bit easier to work with and things that are more complex. And each of you knows, hopefully, your own standing in regard to that. So make a decision that that's what you're going to become familiar with, you're going to practice, so that when you meet things that are unpleasant, difficult, you can bring that into your awareness. Like he said, that's like how people prepare to be out on a battlefield. It's not a pleasant analogy, but nonetheless, they're ready. We talked about this a little bit over dinner, right? Those people who have that kind of ability to quickly respond on a battlefield from some maybe a more instinctual place. We want to be able to respond from the place of wisdom, to be able to say, I know how to look at this right now. I know how to see this right now, and I'm going to do it immediately. Again, don't think that that's possible right from the beginning, but you can develop that skill. And that's all that Buddhism is developing skill. It's not, magic stuff. was interesting. Lama Yeshe apparently was asked once, because of course the whole organization was founded by a bunch of hippies going to India and Nepal, you know, seeking psychedelic experiences and spiritual experiences and who knows what. And a lot of them had this idea of like wanting to find something that was magic. And Lama Yeshe said, the mind is magic. The mind is magic. You know, that's enough. You know, we don't need to look for magic beyond that. The mind is magic enough. So just hope you can work with these teachings. And again, next week I will do the one-off teaching on bridging our differences, and then we'll go into the 4 measurables for the remaining Thursdays of March. Let's do our dedications. We have the dedication list. Oh, sorry. Okay.
So I've been going to, a lot of protests.
Mm-hmm.
And, I see, Save America from Musk and Trump and,
Mm-hmm.
So in your thought, this
Hmm.
is not the right thing to do, right?
Well, again, that gets to be maybe a more complex discussion, because once more, the main thing is that there are actions that beings are engaged in. Let's go to that bottom line, that are not good and are causing harm to beings. And to be a voice of compassion and concern for them is good. But that's an incomplete form of compassion if we don't also have compassion for the perpetrators of these actions. That's the ideal mind that we want to bring to bear. And my concern about protests is that it tends to be from the side of we're having compassion for everybody who's being hurt by these individuals, but them we despise. We want to get them off the island, do whatever we can to not have them in our world. And that's not really the ideal way to approach it, because it's excluding them.
You wouldn't go to a protest, is that right?
Well, I don't go to protests, but if I went to a protest, I want to make sure that the voice that I was giving was one of compassion for all beings. Because I think that's the solution more than it is compassion for the people who are being harmed only. Because the beings who are engaging in the harm, they need our compassion too, because they're going to suffer on the basis of all these actions karmically, right?
Well, that's a difficult question for me.
Yeah. So again, we'll think about it, and we'll get into this a little bit next week when we talk about this idea of where we do have differences and when we do have people on the other side of the aisle, per se, that we need to find some way of seeing their humanity and reaching out to them and not having this feeling of separation. Because this feeling of separation is what's causing all the problems. Them feeling separated from the others, and the others feeling separated from them, and da-da-da-da.
There could be a protest where everybody
Yeah.
and the whole world just starts praying for them.
Yeah.
Openly meditating for them and doing that so across the whole planet
Yeah.
that it would totally disarm them, because they wouldn't need to do what they're doing.
Right. I think it's a wonderful idea. We should get on it right now.
How do you want to organize that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, but even if you organize it so that I heard that there's this statistic that like 4%, if 4% of the population does something, it's a critical mass. I mean, we think it's 51%, and it's not. It's 4%. 4% of the planet doing something.
Monkey syndrome.
Yeah, yeah.
It changes the paradigm.
It changes the paradigm.
Yeah.
It begins the
Yeah.
work. So if we get out to 4% of the population, even, I mean, it's a lot of people still, but nonetheless, that's not half of the population. I like it. Yeah. So let's go through our dedications, because we're running really late tonight. We'll just at least recite the names on the list, and if you need to add any, then let us know at the end.
Dedication merit created from listening to this teaching to those experiencing obstacles, specifically John, Mary Jo, Matt, Jeff Cochran, Ann Twain Martin, Ida, Maybond, Wyatt, Terry, Jana, and those experiencing illness, specifically Bill, Patty, Rolf, Taryn A, Yolanda, Jane, Dorcas, Jill, Michon, B.L. Westover, Steve Handlos, and Kendra Toth. We also dedicate for those who have died recently or who are dying: Lori, Simon Tate, Kate Lockwood, Ella, the Mexican Gray Wolf, Connie, Mona Lee, Adam Muhammad, Monica Silvers, Emily Pike, Latai Tonga, Ali Rasmussen, Jesus Quintanilla, Zoe Holland, David Durant, Connie Paprika, Mike Flood, and Pope Francis.
And maybe we could add Daniel Halleck to
Or
deceased,
Daniel,
Halleck. Just died a few days ago.
anyone else?
Anyone else? Any other names? Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave the camera on Jana. Jana's gonna lead the prayers, so let me get them on the screen again. I can get my cursor thing to work here. Where is it? It's so weird. Disappears when it gets, there it goes. Okay. And prayers. One more. Okay. Are you getting the prayers?
You
You want me to
not
just-
on this TV screen here.
Okay.
No,
The
There they are. Okay, good.
dedication prayer in Tibetan. Gewadi Nyo Da Maha Sangye Du Yo Ne Dwa Chi Kyang Maharupa De Sa Go Pa Sho John Chu Sen Cho Rinpoche Ma Ke Panam Ke Gyurjin Ke Wan Yang Pa Me Pa Yang Gong Me Gong Du Pel Wa Sho. Long life prayers for His Holiness Dalai Lama. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And the same prayer for.
Well, let's just go ahead and since it's running kind of late, let's just dedicate very strongly for the good, or for his return, absolutely. Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation in terms of him being identified very quickly, all the auspicious conditions for him to be raised to be of great benefit to all beings. May that all transpire through our activities here tonight. Okay, thank you all for hanging in there a little bit late tonight. Sorry about that, but figured it would go a little over with this teaching being the last. So I'll see you all again next week. I will be here in person, just to remind everyone. And then there are 2 Thursdays, the 8th and the 15th, when I will not be here in person, but there will be teachings online. And then the last 2 May, I will be here in person again. So good.
Thank you, Donna.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Jana, for leading.
Thank you, Don.
Okay, you're welcome, Will. All right, Stella. We'll